Welcome, everyone. We've already had an informal welcome. This is a conversation about the future of work and well-being. And today I'm Chris. I will be hosting it, and we have Marieke van Vugt from Groningen University as our guest speaker. This is meant to be quite informal, so we encourage you to turn on your camera if you want to, but make sure to mute your mic. It's part of a series which is partially funded by the National Science Foundation, and the organizers are Linda Boyle, Andrew Kuhn, Orit Shear, John Lee, Rafaela Sadoun, Manfred Chaligi, and today I'm myself joining. Before we go to the content, just a quick note on the logistics. This is a recorded session. You can write questions in the chat, and Andrew will moderate the questions. And we'll make sure that you can ask them yourself, ideally by turning on your camera and talking with us so you can be part of the conversation. But beforehand, I have a couple of questions already prepared to get the conversation started. So today with us is Marieke van Vugt from University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Marieke obtained her PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. And after that, you moved to Princeton as a postdoc before moving to Groningen. And our paths sort of crossed because I was just moving out of Groningen, you came to Groningen, but we've been in touch since, so that's nice. You are an assistant professor in the Bernoulli Institute for Mathematics, Computer Science, and Artificial Intelligence, and you are also a member of the Young Academy of Groningen, which is about clever researchers who are enthusiastic about science and spreading the word. In your work, you touch on quite a wide variety of topics and also methods to better understand how people think, or sometimes not think, I guess, to turn off for a while. And it includes machine learning and computational modeling to predict human thinking, and measuring with EEG how people meditate, and also some studies with, for example, Tibetan monks. So we're going to touch on some of those topics today. It's really a broad palette. And in the context of the future of work, I'm quite interested in hearing more about, well, whether this helps. So we'll get to that. So welcome, Marieke, to the conversation this week. To kick the conversation off, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit what mind wandering is exactly, because we've probably all experienced it at some point, but from a scientific perspective, it's quite difficult compared to some other cognitive science tasks where you have a task and you can say, I'm really doing this, but mind wandering is sort of like, I'm not doing this, but also not this and this and this. So how would you describe it?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Chris, and it's great to be chatting again at this point informally. So yeah, and then a great first question, really hard one too, as maybe Caitlin will agree with me, because I'm in a way kind of nervous. Caitlin also works on mind wandering, or has done some work on mind wandering for sure. And I would say the field is deeply divided on how we define mind wandering. At the same time, it is probably the cognitive science concept that is most closely linked to stuff we do in the real world. And maybe that's why it's so hard, because typically what we do, maybe I shall start by just an operational definition, like how we measure things in the lab, and then I can say a few words about the kind of definitional fights that are happening in this field. But basically, the innovation in mind wandering research is the idea that we bring the subjective into the lab by taking a task, any task, preferably a kind of boring task, so that people are pretty likely to get distracted. And then in that task, you basically ask people every minute or so, what are you thinking about? Were you thinking about the task? Were you thinking about maybe sounds or feelings in your body or anything? And then you can examine what happens in the task, or maybe what happens in the brain or in the eye or in the heart rate or whatever, to these self-report judgments. And you might then say, well, we have task-related thinking and then everything else, and that everything else could be labeled as mind wandering. If you want to be very liberal in your definition of mind wandering, you can also say, as for example, Kalina Christoph has been advocating, mind wandering is really only when the person has some very unconstrained thought process that's not, you know, being driven by anything. And then we have separately rumination, where you're stuck on a particular concept, and then you might just be completely blank, and maybe all of those things are not really mind wandering. So I'm not sure how useful it is to really fight over these things. It's probably helpful to be aware that there's lots of stuff that's happening in our minds while we're doing anything, and including cognitive tasks. And typically when we put people in a lab to study cognition, we assume that they're only doing our attention task or our memory task, but actually probably about 50% of the time they're not doing that, and they're doing other stuff. And then maybe the last thing I want to say about this, which is also I think pretty important, is that you know, in a psychology lab, it's quite clear what the task is. In many real life situations, what the task is not even that clear. Like, we're probably doing multiple things at the same time. So then also how all these task related that's why, you know, how all these task related concepts like, you know, sustained attention and conflict monitoring and executive function, how they all relate to what we do in the real world is quite unclear. And actually maybe then mind wandering in a way is maybe a bit more clear than any of those other things.
Right. So it's like it's clearer than the tasks that we think are clear. Right. I like that. I like that twist. What I thought was interesting in how you defined it is that there's two forms of subjective here. In a sense, there's the subjective, because I think from a human-computer interaction perspective, which many in the audience are, we're okay with some subjective measurement because we want to know what the user is doing and how they experience it. But it's interesting that there's sort of two types of subjective in that sense in the data, because there's both the subjective experience of the person, what they think they are doing, whether they call it I was just drifting off or I was thinking about something else, right? The words they choose, and the subjective part of the researcher who's trying to make sense of it. And depending on the tradition of mind wandering that they come from, whether they even consider it part of mind wandering or not. So that's very interesting that there's that broad appreciation of where it comes from. So I was looking at some of your work. So this is basically the probing method, right? Which you write a lot about. That's sort of the convention of we probe someone and ask them, well, what were you thinking at this moment? And you have to get at it because of the subjective experience. And what I think is cool about your work is that you're trying to get at, can we measure it something else, right? So in some other way. So can the subjective be related to something that we measure in the brain through electroencephalogram or and using machine learning? So as we talked a little bit about that probing side, I'm now very interested in whether you can tell a little bit about, for some of the research you used support vector machines to detect patterns in EEG data. Can you maybe explain how that works? And I'll provide the link to the paper in the chat if people really want to know the details, but in a nutshell, what happens in such a task or such a...
Yeah, so great question. I would say, well, what we do in that, and we have a series of papers about this right now. My PhD student, Christina Yin, the first author on the paper, is about to finish her PhD. I mean, she finished her PhD, so she's hopefully going to defend it soon. And basically what we do in all of these experiments is we give people a very boring task. So maybe an example of that, such a task would be, you see a stream of digits on the screen. Once every 2 seconds or so, there would be a digit, and you have to press the button whenever you see the digit, except when the digit is the number 3. So you can imagine that's not a very inspiring task. So people are ready to go and mind wander. And then every minute or so, kind of with some randomness, you ask them, okay, were you thinking about the task, or were you thinking about any other stuff? And then what we can do is we record at the same time the EEG of this person. So we then know that at time point X, they were maybe on task, and then we can label the preceding maybe 15 seconds of EEG as being task. And then at some other point, they say, I was thinking about, I was daydreaming. Okay, that would be a clear case of mind wandering. So we're going to label that one as mind wandering. And then, so then you can debate about what you're going to do when you label something as when you have to label like they were distracted by their foot or something. But anyway, it doesn't really matter that much. You just have two categories, and then you have these pieces of EEG that correspond to these two categories, and then you can feed those into a classifier. As you pointed out, indeed, we are using predominantly a support vector machine. Support vector machine is the one that seemed to work best from the ones we tried, and they're still pretty simple classifiers. So you give the support vector machine a whole bunch of these examples, and then you see how well it after it's been trained, then you give it some new data, and then you test how well is it doing. The cool thing actually of the support vector machine, by the way, has to be a non-linear support vector machine. So we also tried a linear one, but we needed a radial basis function support vector machine to do it reasonably well, and reasonably well really means with 65% accuracy. So it's not great, but it's above chance, And then we were able to train the classifier on one task, like in this case, this one with the digits, or a variant of that called a sustained attention to response task. And then we're actually able to predict mind wandering in a visual search task, so a very different kind of task, and vice versa. And actually in a second paper, we're also able to build one general classifier that was able to predict it across participants. And then you might wonder, well, can we get any better from the 65%? So in the third paper, we're then using some deep learning, because, these days, everybody likes deep learning. That's the magic, apparently. So we're wondering about that. Can we get better? Well, it turns out, spoiler alert, we aren't getting that much better, maybe about 70% at most. But actually, the cool thing is that the deep learning allowed us to generalize from one experiment to a very different experiment that was using even a slightly different, I mean, it was both biosemi-EEG equipment, but one case was 128 electrodes, the other case was 32 electrodes. So it seems to pick up more generalizable things. So it is,
yeah, that's cool.
It's difficult.
You have then a lot less data points to go by with the 32 electrodes, right? So you measure at a quarter
lower
of
density
the points than otherwise with 128. And then you referred to 3 papers. I haven't prepared all 3 of those, but maybe we should have you in the end, after the conversation, you put in the link to Christina's dissertation, because I'm sure that all of the work will be in there. Then right. Everyone can read that. Because some of the work that I did encounter when I was preparing is that you looked at mind wandering, low task performance, low vigilance, which, as someone who's not an expert on mind wandering, me, that sound all very related. So I thought that was also very clever that you're able to pick that up. So how does that work?
Right. Yeah. So in that paper, that was the second paper which I previously mentioned as that the case where we could generalize, make one classifier across all participants. So in that study, not only did we generalize the classifier across all the participants, we were also indeed curious about the overlap between mind wandering and a state of being just low vigilance. And we operationalized that in a very simple way with the idea that if you do this kind of a task, this very boring task, then in the beginning you're still fresh, you're like, yes, let's do this, press the button, And then at the end, you're like, after an hour, sort of like, okay, I'm done. When is this over? So you might have all sort of literally seen that happen if you've ever run participants in these kind of tasks. So yeah, that we were just basically comparing the beginning and the end of the task, the first and the second half. And then the other thing, indeed, we were curious about is if we compare more easy and more difficult condition, because presumably if you have a very few sort of mental if you are in a task situation with low task demands, then there is plenty of plenty of time for mind wandering, whereas in a situation with high task demands, you're just so busy, you're automatically not going to mind wander. It doesn't even require that much of the cognitive control. So what we did was we trained classifiers, say, to distinguish between situations of low and high task demands, and then we tested whether it could also predict the labels of mind-wandering self-reports. And similarly, we trained a classifier on distinguishing between the beginning and the end of the task, where in the one case, the beginning, people were fresh, in the end, they were kind of totally exhausted. And again, checked whether if we trained the classifier on that situation, that it would actually make accurate predictions for the self-reports of mind wandering, because you presumably, if those are overlapping processes, then your brain should look similar. So if we train the classifier to learn what your brain looks like when you're feeling kind of tired, when you are in a low vigilance situation, if that's is similar to what your brain looks like, if that's similar to mind wandering, then your brain should look similar during states of high mind wandering compared to during states of low or no mind wandering. So it should be able to generalize those predictions. And the whole point of the paper was that these processes did not generalize at all, even though we were able to train classifiers above chance. And we also found that they were picking up on different parts of brain activity. So.
Right. Very nice. It sounds like a very hard task to do up front. So it's already, I think, really impressive that these algorithms can detect some of those patterns, right? It's almost like we're asking too much of them if they can work everywhere. So it's really cool that you've gotten part of that way, I think. I had a lot of more detailed questions, but we've already covered quite some detail. So I also want to talk about some of, I'll just call it the fun research that you're doing. I mean, this research is also fun, but you have two passions, ballet dancing and meditation, and you apply these techniques also to those settings, which I think it's really cool if you can combine all of your hobbies, right? Science is also a hobby for all of us. But before talking about this content, I was wondering whether if you are ballet dancing, and I've seen, for those who haven't followed Marieke on social media, but she is known for the hotel fee, where whenever she visits a conference, she dances some ballet in the hotel room in preparation, and she shares that, which is really nice. And now I'm not sure, maybe you did some ballet dancing today because we have this virtual meeting, or is that still coming up? Maybe let's start with that.
Right. Well, yeah. So actually, I know the hotel fee series obviously is slightly terminated in the past year because there weren't many hotels to be visited. But they've been replaced by the Living Room Ballet series, which is has new episodes almost every day. It's just happening mostly on Instagram. So if you're interested, just look me up on Instagram. And actually, literally, it's been for me. I noticed that a lot of people found it quite entertaining. So I was like, well, it's actually very helpful for me to video myself dancing, because I notice so much more. It sometimes feels different when you're dancing compared to what it looks like on a video. So it's obviously sometimes shocking, but I post the nice bits that those I share with others.
It's really cool. So do you ever mind wander during ballet?
Well, so actually that's it depends on how you define mind wandering, but during ballet it's quite hard to mind wander. Maybe that's why I also find it quite therapeutic, because it requires a lot of different mental processes. So you have to be, the teacher tells you a bunch of steps to do, which you have to then remember. Then there is music playing and you have to synchronize your movements to the music and remember the right step to do at the right moment. And then you have to remember what muscles to use at what time and try to figure out whether you're doing all of the muscles that you're supposed to be using, which is quite complex motor patterns there. And then on top of that, ideally, if you still have any mental space left, any mental resources left, then you should also probably try to, at least I find it most fun if I manage to get some artistic expression in there. So between all of those things, I mean, I'm never bored, right? There's so much going on in any particular class. So nice. That's, I think, why it helps me to be in a completely different mental space, which I find very helpful to, you know, as a to manage my mental sanity in a challenging work environment. So
very nice. And I saw on your homepage where you have some pictures about the dancing, but also that you had a collaboration with Random Collision, the group is called, and they were dancing while they were wearing these EEG caps and you were walking around them and you were trying to measure whether they synchronize. My first thought was, oh my God, you're putting all that equipment out there. It's so prone to break. This is what we tell the students in the lab, like, don't break it. You can use it freely. But that was my first thought, like, it breaks. But then the second thought was, did it work? Did you find something?
Well, the first question is, it was definitely pretty scary. So the good thing is I am using biosemi EEG equipment, and actually, interestingly enough, that's very portable. So it fits in a suitcase. I mean, we might get to this. I've also brought it in a suitcase to India, which is also pretty scary, but you know, it fits in a carry-on suitcase. So I was just safely keeping it with me on the plane. I was like, you know, this carry-on has to be in the cabin. I'm sorry, it has to be. And then so that it wouldn't get lost somewhere with some kind of security officer in some obscure, anyway, that would be, interesting episodes at Indian airports having to unpack the whole thing, but that's a different story. But anyway, so you can carry it around. What?
We get to that after the recording, and we'll get the details of that part.
So, but anyway, so you can bring it along, and actually, if we were able to follow the dancers properly, it worked totally fine. We did order a couple of extra of these cables, the what do you call them? The bundles, optical fibers. So they are the ones that connect the EEG caps to the amplifiers, and they are obviously optical fibers. So there's glass in there, so that's a bit fragile. So we got a couple of extra, but that's not too expensive, so that's okay. And we were telling the dancers continuously, like, be careful. And then I had so many moments that I was freaking out because the dancers forgot all about the wires and then started turning, and we were around them, like, getting completely stressed. At least I did. Anyway, so that was interesting, but we did eventually figure out how to collect EEG data without too many accidents, because it's, well, at some point also you start to lose connection if they get too entangled in the wire. So we had to figure out how to appropriately secure the wire so that they wouldn't get pulled off too much. I think that was our main challenge in the end. So probably towards the end of the performances, we figured that out. So I think the main thing we learned in these performances was that there's different ways that the dancers can use to connect to each other. So the whole theme of the research was about how people can sort of subjectively connect with each other. And we were wondering whether that was in some way related to the synchrony between their brains. Now, what we learned over the course of these experiments in the performances was that the most powerful way, subjectively speaking, for dancers to connect was first of all, by moving together with each other as if where they felt as if they're a single body. So they were like touching each other and then trying to move as a single body. So that was very powerful, much more powerful than, say, trying to have synchronized movement. And the other way that was very powerful was in a dialogue where, you know, one dancer would move, the other would respond in movement, and they would have this dialogue where the response doesn't mean it's the same movement, but it's something that emerges in a natural response to that. So that was quite interesting. Then in terms of the brain findings, we're still sort of sorting through the data. Actually, I would say that in terms of the data from the performances, I'm not sure how much we can use, because it was such a complex situation with so much going on that it's hard to know at any point whether it's signal or noise. But at the same time, we did follow that up. And I think that maybe is also a big learning point for us, is that we could use the performances as sort of a hypothesis search space where we would, you know, find interesting things to then explore more systematically in a follow-up lab experiment where we had people move in these different conditions that I just mentioned and collected both subjective ratings and EEG signals. And it seemed like these dialogue and one body conditions were also accompanied by an increase in interbrain synchrony, I think predominantly in the theta band. But again, we haven't published this yet. We're still, I have, you know, this is the second or third student who's been working on the data, trying to, you know, really sort through it and try out lots of different measures to make sure that we get reliable results. So
yeah, it sounds like a very difficult problem to solve, because there's no objective like this is the event that happens, this is where I need to measure the EEG data before and after. I've seen that there was already at least one good question in the chat, and I want to encourage everyone to ask more questions. But before we do that, I do want to hear a little bit about the Tibetan monk story, because that is just too good not to share, right? So I think those are people that are only relaxing and praying and thinking, and all of a sudden this cool scientist from the Netherlands comes and they want to collaborate and attach stuff to their brains and their bodies. So in a nutshell, how does that come about, that you are in that opportunity that you can measure there? Because that sounds probably we can fill a whole conversation just on that topic. Yeah. But you have analyzed some of that data about meditation. So maybe what did you learn about meditation and the brain?
Right. Well, so in that study, actually, while you might have the image of Tibetan monks being, you know, relaxing or sitting alone in a cave meditating, actually really what they do, especially in the tradition that I've been investigating, is that they're very, very active, and they're in particular engaging in a kind of reasoning-based meditation that's a form of debate which almost looks like a dance. Like you could see them shouting at each other, clapping, and it's a very, very active thing. And that's where we got started with this interbrain synchrony, because we're like, okay, this is clearly a social practice. So what's going on in the synchrony between their brains while they're engaged in this, again, very complex situation? I don't know, I somehow always end up in these weird research projects. So it also has a very disciplined and clear logical structure. So actually last January, we held our first online winter school where we taught Westerners about this style of debating, which is really about trying to look at things from many different angles and systematically uncover inconsistencies. Anyway, so it's quite an interesting, complex practice to study, which might help to cultivate some degree of mental flexibility. Nevertheless, what we found in this study as one of the initial findings, obviously, again, we still have a mountain of data that we're trying to make sense of, and you run into lots of issues like cultural differences and all of that fun stuff. So we can talk more about that later. But one of the things we found, that even though this kind of practice doesn't really look like the stereotype meditation where a person just sits there quietly, you know, and looking very, very calm, you still normally in those studies, what they found is that meditation is associated with increases in frontal midline theta waves, and that means that the slow low frequency waves around 4 to 9 hertz, that they increase, and they are in the front part of the brain, that they increase in their amplitude during the practice. So we found that actually the same kind of waves increased in these monks, and more so for experienced than for beginner monks, and also more so during more challenging, intense forms of the practice compared to simple forms of the practice. The other thing we found is that, in debating, of course, sometimes they are agreeing with each other, they're in the same line of thoughts. Sometimes, the one is trying to, if you will, well, they're sort of on this different page. Like one thinks, okay, I'm agreeing, I hold this point, and the other is like trying to figure out what's not consistent with that point. How can you have a different kind of viewpoint? So then when they're disagreeing, then there's synchrony between the two brains, and again the front part of the brain, but now slightly faster brain wave. It's called alpha. That's from about 10 to 14 hertz. That was higher when they were agreeing compared to when they were disagreeing. So those were some of the findings. So yeah, and I would say that this is actually a really interesting meditation practice that's potentially also applicable in education situations, or maybe even for researchers to explore their research matters in a systematic way, to look at it maybe from many more different angles than they normally do, to really literally question everything. But that's a different topic.
Right. I like this idea of synchrony, asynchrony, and being collaborative versus trying to find a counter argument. It's quite nice that within that one setting that you can really look at that rich behavior or thinking process.
Although now we're actually, one of my PhD students is exploring that in a more disciplined sort of setting of a lab task for tacit coordination, which is really, you have two people sitting in computers next to each other, but they're not allowed to talk, and they see 4 pictures of different kind of stimuli, and they have to choose the same one without actually, talking or communicating in any way. And the way they would figure out how to choose the right one is that they would eventually converge at some rules. Like they might figure out that, the other one is always picking up the one that has most contrast, or the one that is the greenest or the reddest or something like that. And now we're exploring whether that's associated with systematic, like when you are making the same choice, so whether you figured out the other's rule, whether that's associated with increases in interbrain synchrony. Well, we don't know yet, but
well, next conversation we'll have to talk about that. Sounds like you'll need some time to analyze. Andrew, you've been keeping an eye on the chat, I believe.
Yes, and actually, you just talked about where some of the work that you're doing might be applicable, and I think Caitlin has a question about that.
Am I supposed to just ask it? Okay.
Oh yeah, sorry, Caitlin. So if you'd like to, go ahead, please ask her. I'm happy to read it, but since you're already talking.
Sure. Yeah, so the detector stuff is super cool with EEG, and I was just wondering if you had thought any about future work in terms of like applying these in real time, and like what context do you think they might be helpful? So is it meditation, education, and so forth?
Yeah, so definitely we want to continue with this. So we are working on the one hand now on a clinical trial of patients with depression, where we're interested in the effect of different depression interventions on the mind wandering that occurs. And at the same time, we're curious whether if we train a classifier to distinguish not just mind wandering from not mind wandering, but maybe especially depressive rumination from not mind wandering, whether we can see changes on effects of these interventions in a more detailed way using these classifiers. And on top of that, we're also now working on a study of meditators, where we want to use these kind of classifiers. First, train them on instructed mental states, like now, start thinking about yourself. Now, try to focus on the breath, and then train the classifier on those states, and then test it on a more free meditation session, and then see whether the prevalence of different mental states changes as a function, for example, of experience. So those are just some of the things we're currently working on. I think one other interesting direction is that, as I mentioned, the classifier accuracy is fairly low. So, I don't think actual application in a classroom or whatever would be really that feasible. Moreover, I think it also has a lot of ethical concerns associated with it. I'm not sure whether we'd even want that. Or application in a work environment. It's like, I don't know whether I'd want that. They have it apparently in China, but I don't really believe those systems, given what I've seen for the accuracy, even of research grade equipment, let alone sort of the over-the-counter EEG equipment. But I think that one thing that would be quite interesting is to see whether we can increase accuracy by having participants who are a bit more skilled in observing their subjective minds. Maybe those people who have extensive training in meditation would be doing better and would generate more reliable estimates than those who do not. So that would be, I think, an interesting way to go. There are some studies also that show that, for example, experience in meditation seems to be associated with improvement in BCI accuracy. So that maybe, again, if there's less noise in the labels, then we can train our classifiers better.
Right. I was wondering that from a human-computer interaction perspective, whether in brain-computer interaction there's potential there, because that task sort of the which figure are you looking at and coordinating it for people who have lockdown syndrome or something like that. I mean, there are dedicated BCI efforts already, of course, for such types of tasks, but I'm wondering, there's probably a lot of potential there to also inform that type of research, sort of to really separate out you're now really concentrating on a task, or you're doing something else, or maybe in safety critical settings, like you're really drifting off, like get back to concentrate. Yeah.
And I'm also really interested in, well, as I said, in our study of depressed patients, we are going to not just classify this sort of mind wandering versus on task, which is a contrast that has its problems, as I mentioned, but maybe we can be much more specific about the kind of mental states that we're distinguishing, because probably daydreaming is quite different from rumination, from being in a blank state. So if we were to be able to be to have maybe better categories of classifying thoughts, then maybe that could also make us do better.
So there are a couple of questions that I think that perhaps you could address, and they're sort of similar and sort of different. So Jesse is talking about very specific, what exactly are you measuring? And then Maxim is also asking about what exactly are we measuring? So maybe we start with Jesse and start with that question first.
Sure. So very interesting work. So I was wondering basically if what you're saying that you're measuring is actually what you measure. So in the first paper that Chris linked in chat, it says you're probing for how much mind wandering is going on every 30 to 120 seconds. So I'm actually wondering, like, isn't that too often? Like, aren't you actually invoking something else like annoyance, because people are interrupting my tasks every 2 minutes, and I'm not gonna like that very much.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Actually, they have done studies where they compared versions of the task with and without such what are called thought probes, with and without such questions, and they didn't really observe strong differences as a function of those thought probes. So it seems to be okay. And I think people have also played around with the frequency of thought probes. Of course, it's always a trade-off, because if you get basically 1 measurement per minute, which is what this interval corresponds to, then you need, you can get 60 measurements in an hour, which is still not that great, but it's sort of doable. So yeah, I guess that's been the trade-off. Ideally, we wouldn't disturb the participants so much, which is why it would be great if we can derive some estimate of mind wandering from EEG, or also we've been doing some work with pupil size, where especially the evoked pupil size by well, maybe that's at least the clearest way of it's also called phasic pupil size. So how much the pupil responds to incoming stimuli, that seems to be also quite indicative of mind wandering, and the idea being that if you are mind wandering, if you're all lost in thoughts, then your pupil is just not going to respond that much to incoming stimuli.
And then, Maxim, you had a question that goes back to perhaps what exactly mind wandering is. And Marieke, you were also already talking about different types of thoughts, but Maxim, maybe you can go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So it's a really interesting talk. Thank you. And I'm really curious. Usually in science, when there's not a very specific definition of something, I think it's harder to work with that topic. So how do you deal with in terms of mind wandering? Because as far as I'm concerned, it's not completely agreed upon all those details. So what do you do? What are your thoughts on how do you do research on that topic?
Yeah, so for me, I think like I did here, is I like to just predominantly stick with the operational definition as sort of a starting point, because at least we can be clear on what's going on there, and then how we interpret that in terms of theories, that you can question that. And there's sometimes also researchers in this field would say, well, we're not going to call it mind wandering. I mean, sometimes I like to call it mind wandering just to plug it into that literature, because it is about stuff that we don't directly tell people to do, but that just happens. Maybe that's another way that I could say this, but literally speaking, maybe we could also call it task unrelated thought, which is one common definition that's been used, which in many of the psychology experiments seems pretty reasonable to use. Or spontaneous thought. It's not exactly the same, but it's something about I don't tell you to do as a researcher, and yet it happens. So those are all helpful concepts, and I think making consciously this distinction between, on the one hand, this is what we measure, which is not perfectly related to any of those theoretical ideas, and then thinking about the theory and then trying to build different, make different mappings and then see what happens. I think that's how it works best for me, and especially in this topic where you also have some intuitions just from observing your own mind in your own life. So they're just going by that as well really is very helpful.
That makes sense. Thank you.
I was thinking of Maxim's question in a different way. How do you convince reviewer number 2 on the review of your paper, where reviewer number 2 goes, 1 and 3 are okay with the definition, and reviewer 2 goes like, is this really mind wandering? But that's,
well, we've had actually poor Christina especially has had so many nasty reviewers and difficulty in getting the stuff published. I would say, but yeah, and sometimes the fights were also about these definitions, but I think what we've tried to do is just to stick more with the measurements and just saying, well, the data are the data, right? And you can decide how you want to interpret it. And one of the things we've tried is so you have these multiple choice questions where you ask, people say, I was paying attention to the task. Oh, that's pretty clear. But then, I was thinking about my performance on the task. So is that mind wandering or is that task? So you can then, do the analysis all these different ways and then look at the differences. And, sometimes it doesn't really make that much of a difference. So then whatever, it's fine. And then if you manipulate something like working memory, well, maybe different theories would predict different things, but then you have your measurements. And I think that's what we contribute, right? So, yeah.
Exactly. Marieke, this has really been a joy to hear a lot about parts of your research, because we've only scratched the surface for some of these, but you've already covered a lot of ground. So thank you again for taking part in the conversation. Next week is Casey Fiesler from the University of Colorado in Boulder. There's no title yet, but I did see that she does research in also an interesting mix of topics and methods. So social computing, ethics, law, and fan communities. So that's what we're going to hear about next.